Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, if you've been watching this series up to now, you'll know that its focus is this universal human problem of existential alienation, or you could say self division, the sense of a disconnect between the thinking ego and nature, whether it be external nature or more fundamentally, really our internal nature, our feeling selves, reason and passion, basically. And it really affects us in every moment of our existence because basically everything we do depends on how we sort these two out in our daily decision making. And existential despair can come about in humans, I think, when we feel overwhelmed by this disconnect. Something always seems to get lost in translation between feeling and reason. But conversely, deep, even ecstatic hope can arise when these two elements seem in alignment. I've talked about some of the ways this problem is represented and to some extent solved in ancient Greek culture, religion, and art, and how it, at the very least, lurks in the background of all of Plato's dialogues. I'm particularly excited about this episode because today we're going to be diving for the first time into the Platonic dialogue that, in my view, is really focused on solving this universal human problem. You might remember in an earlier episode I mentioned the Renaissance humanist Marsilio Ficino, the Florentine who translated works by Plato and the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus from Greek into Latin. He called them divine oracles for the human race. Well, it's this dialogue that I feel more than any other announces existential hope to humanity. I see it as a kind of manifesto of that deep or ecstatic hope. If you watched my last episode, you'll know which dialogue I'm talking about. It's called the Symposium, and you may find yourself taken quite aback by it for more than one reason. First, this book doesn't really bear much resemblance to modern philosophical writing. This is not an abstract, I almost want to say dry, treatise or text dealing with problems that only academics think about. This dialogue recounts a drinking party. That's what symposium or symposion meant in ancient Greece. A drinking together, featuring some of the most well-known characters in Athens at the time. They're playwrights, a military hero, where the conversation really kind of runs wild. There's wine, flirtation, homosexual usually is. There's oversharing, hiccuping, and puns. Most of the talk is about sex, or at least sexual desire, or love, sexual love. Both these are conveyed in the ancient Greek word eros. Last, but certainly not least, if you're new to Plato or to classical Athens generally, you'll likely be surprised, possibly in a way you'll find quite unpleasant, about one type of sexual relationship that crops up in the dialogue, one that seems to have been fairly common in Greece at the time, at least among the upper classes. It's a homosexual relationship involving a wide age disparity. Adult men courted adolescent males. It seems the older partner often played a kind of tutelary role over the younger partner. To quote the Plato scholar C.D.C. Reeve, a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, this type of relationship, quote, was represented as primarily educative rather than sexual. That's how it was represented anyway, he says. By associating with someone who was already a man, a boy learned arete, civic virtue or excellence. He learned how to be a man himself. We might think here of rites of passage in primitive warrior societies, some of which also involve sex between men and boys. In the Sambia tribe of Papua New Guinea, for example, boys must have oral sex with men as part of becoming men themselves. It is often suggested, indeed, that Greek paiderastia, that's the name for this practice, had its roots in a warrior past. That's what Reeve says. And I think it's fair to wonder similarly if many of these male tutelary relationships throughout history, especially in contexts where there were few women, also had a sexual element, at least occasionally. For example, that between medieval knight and squire. Anyway, despite the at least partially tutelary role, protective role that the older man had in these relationships in ancient Greece, it's a bit hard not to think that at least some of these relationships must have involved at least some degree of exploitation, given this wide age gap, and perhaps even psychological trauma. It's difficult for us looking back on it more than 2 millennia later to really know or to judge. It's an example of the kind of thing I talked about in an earlier episode, that idea of history or the humanities being a kind of journey underground, an odyssey into our collective underneath, comparable in some ways to the psychotherapeutic process for the individual, where not every discovery we make is likely to be pleasant or make us feel comfortable. While I think there's something universal about human morality, even the briefest glance into history shows that it also changes enormously over time. It's both constant and changing, and we're bound to be surprised by what we find. And I think I talked in an earlier episode about how it seems likely that incest throughout human history has probably not been as rare as we would like to think in our ancestors. It's worth remembering how daily life in these past ages would have been so enormously different, I think, from our own. These kids would have grown up seeing other human beings being treated as objects, as property, on a daily basis. They themselves would have undergone military training at an early age, and may well have only a few years later been killed or wounded quite horribly in battle, particularly in the Athens in which Plato grew up, which was racked by the Peloponnesian War between Athens, Sparta, and their respective allies. And that lasted close to 30 years. A pretty big chunk of Plato's entire life, actually. Plato's dialogue Theaetetus is named after one of its main characters, who, as the introduction to my edition of the dialogue puts it, was, quote, a charming lad, modest, well-mannered, and quick of apprehension. But the dialogue is recounted by a man looking back on it a few years later. And this is quite poignant, if not tragic, actually. Just after having seen Theaetetus being carried from the front in Corinth back to Athens on death's door, from both severe wounds, even more miserably dysentery, death basically through extreme and bloody diarrhea. Meanwhile, the sisters of these guys would have had to live a cloistered existence as, in a way, second-rate humans, and also face the risk of a young death in giving birth. And over everyone, of course, hung the threat of death at any time, from diseases to which the doctors of the day had no cure. In 430 BC, when Plato was just a toddler, a plague went through Athens that took an estimated quarter of the population. By comparison, COVID-19 from 2020 to 2023 killed, at least according to estimates I've found, around 7 million people worldwide out of a population of more than 7 billion. so less than about a tenth of a percent. A bit of a digression here. It's also interesting to note the physical shape people of this time seem to have been in, something else that surprises us today. Socrates at the beginning of the Republic mentions that he walked down from Athens to the Piraeus, the port of Athens, to watch a festival. The distance is about 5 miles, so 10 miles of walking that day. Plus, it's unlikely he would have been sitting, I think, in Piraeus while he watched it. I don't think there was really a culture of sitting until modern times. Not really, not for most people. Medieval churches, for example, had no pews. You would likely have been wandering around. But all this walking is mentioned in the dialogue not as some impressive accomplishment, but as a sort of by the way. And also, you get the impression from the way the characters in these dialogues interact with each other, teasing and gently ridiculing each other, and taking this with good humor, that most of the people maybe were more comfortable in each other's company, and that there was less social insecurity. Anyway, my point is, getting back to my earlier point, it's that journeys into the underworld can turn up disturbing things. But I think they also hold the potential of being enormously enriching for those who make them. There's actually nothing preventing the same experience being both unsettling and enriching. And I think that's what Socrates' persistent questioning of his fellow citizens was all about. And I think this is true of Plato's dialogues, especially the Symposium. Perhaps the most unsettling thing of all about it is Plato's solution of this problem of self-division or self-alienation. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, the narrator of the Symposium claims to have experienced a kind of inner revolution under the influence of Socrates. And more than 2 millennia later, as we'll see a little bit later in this series, and this is an inner revolution that comes not from persistent attempts at trying to get a dogma into somebody. It comes only from the asking of questions. And so more than 2 millennia later, as we'll see a little bit later in this series, the Symposium challenges us to start living in an entirely new way, on an entirely new principle. How do we know this problem of the self is the problem of the Symposium? That'll be the subject of my next episode. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.